Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar of DATPROF about when to address your test data problems. My name is Maarten Urbach and I will be your host and presenter for today. If you have any questions during this webinar, please feel free to ask them in the chat box. In the chat box you can ask the questions that you have during this webinar and I will try to answer them afterwards. Before we really start, let me quickly introduce a little bit more about myself and about DATPROF. My name is Maarten Urbach once again, and I work roughly about 10 years right now for DATPROF. And I've always been able, and I'm always trying to help customers out with addressing their test data problems and trying to create a solution for them. DATPROF as an organization has a goal and a vision, and our goal is to really simplify getting the right test data at the right place at the right moment, in the right place at the right moment. And we try to solve it to really get test data easily accessible and readily available when you need it, when you want it. And that's what we try to achieve. And we are really proud that with our global customer base, we're able to achieve such wonderful results. We achieve those with our products suite, and our product suite consists out of DATPROF Privacy, DATPROF Subset, DATPROF Analyze, and DATPROF Runtime. DATPROF Privacy is primarily for helping you getting compliant by masking or generating synthetic test data. DATPROF Subset helps you out in creating reduced small sets of test data instead of using full-size copies of a production database. DATPROF Analyze in the end, or almost in the end, is our product to discover and profile where privacy-sensitive data may be stored. And DATPROF Runtime is our test data automation and central test data platform to help you really get easily accessible test data. And in the end, it roughly looks somewhat like this, that we have several development tools like Analyze, Subset, and Privacy that are on top of the DATPROF Runtime central platform. And with the help of these applications, you can easily deploy the different subset and privacy templates to your specific environment. And we do that for all sorts of databases and cloud platforms like Azure, AWS, and Google Cloud. So this is roughly what we do as a company and with the products that we deliver to our customers. With that being said, let's go to the real content for today. And that's in the end the question, when do you need to address your test data problems? And over what I mentioned at the start, over the last couple of 10 years, I've been trying to help customers out with these issues. And I saw that many of them always struggled with the question, when should we really start using or really start solving our test data problems? And I tried to, during this webinar, I will try to explain and give you an answer to this question. And there are a few steps or a few questions. There are pretty conceptual in the end, but it will help you to generate your question or an answer to yourself. Is it worthwhile? Is it interesting? Is there an interesting business case to be created around test data management for your organization? To start off with, in most cases, start off with a really simple question. And if this answer to this question is yes, and the question is, do you have personal privacy sensitive data in your test environment or in your production environment, for example, then if the answer is yes, then you should solve it. There's no question about it. If the answer is no, then maybe there are a few other questions that you can ask yourself, which I also will do during this webinar, of course, that still might help you out in still thinking about addressing your test data problems. If the answer is yes, then you have to do something about it. And of course, it's a really simple question to answer, yes or no, but I do understand that it can have high impact. As DATPROF, we understand it, and we also created several different webinars already, but also white papers, all sorts of information to help you out with discovering how you can mask it, because it can have a high impact. It's a simple question, but it can have high impact. But when do you think about personal or privacy sensitive data? Well, that's a rather interesting question, of course. What we tend to use in a discussion with a customer is this slide. In most cases, we are interested in discussing this with a customer with this slide deck. And this is not a full list of all the different data that might be there, but it's quite interesting already to start the discussion if you have truly privacy sensitive data in your database. Roughly, we see two different types of personal data that's stored inside a database. We call it identifiable data or characteristical data. Identifiable data is like name, date of birth, whatever is listed below identifiable. And what's interesting about the identifiable data is that it, in most cases, directly or rather directly leads you to one or a small list of customers or individuals that you can find based upon the identifiable data. But on the other hand, not every single data point, data content that I wrote down, like name, for example, is not always privacy sensitive in the end, because there are also public and open sources available that give you exactly the same result. Of course, the bank account numbers, social security numbers are way more privacy sensitive, and maybe you should do something already about it. But some of the other stuff like address maybe is not so privacy sensitive. On the other hand, we have the characteristical data. In most cases, we see that characteristical data is more privacy sensitive than the identifiable data, because it tells you something about the person itself. It tells you more about the individual. What's his bank balance? Does he have mortgages? Does he take medicine? What's his religion? In most cases, we all find it also important, and it's more telling something about ourselves than your own name. In the end, if you have information that's characteristical, I think you should really cover your test data problems by doing something to protect them. That's also what the data protection authorities would like you to do. You need to protect those data. So with that being said, roughly in the end, if you have one of the few things, this is an interesting slide that you can use to understand if there's something that you can address if you have personal privacy data. So if you have one of those, please address your test data problems. If that's not truly the case, then there's another question that you can ask yourselves. Are there many and or large databases in your test environment? And this is always a little bit interesting, of course, because it's also a little bit, well, it's in the eye of the beholder. When do you think about that you have many databases? When do you think about that you have a large database? It's a little bit dependent on what's your perspective on the world. Because you can have really large databases, but you can also have a large amount of small databases. What's in the end truly interesting, of course, is how much effort it takes to get these environments available in your environment. Because a large database in itself, a few of them may not be so complicated. But if they're truly large and big, for example, multiple terabytes, it can be really time consuming to place such a database in your test environment. And the same appears, of course, for if you have a small database, but many of those. If there are many of the same database that you need to deploy, it's also time consuming. Let alone if both are the case, of course. If you have both large and many, this can be time consuming. In the end, it's not truly about the real size or the real number. It's really about the time consuming, how much time it takes to get these databases in your test environment. What's also in most cases the issue is that we see that many organizations don't have a real person responsible. There's a lack of responsibility inside an organization about who's responsible for the test data. The refreshment of test data. What about if there's an issue in your test data environments or in your test environments or with your test data? Is there somebody you can go to? In most cases, we see there's a lack of responsibility. And this is an issue, and especially if there are too many and large databases available, we really think it's worthwhile getting somebody responsible to make sure that test data is properly deployed in your environments. So in the end, if you have many and or large databases, I think if the answer is yes, you should really try to solve your test data problems. If the answer is no, And then we'll go, of course, to the next sheet. There might be some other questions that you can ask yourself as well. And this is the, well, not the final, I have some last, after this one, there's another question. This question is about, does it take too long to get test data available? And this is also rather interesting. It looks a little bit the same as the first, but there is a little bit of a difference. But in the end, if it takes too long, you should do something about your test data problem. Of course, too long is roughly as the question before. It's a little bit in the eye of the beholder. It's a little bit in perspective. For myself, maybe it's not too long. For another, it may be too long. So time is a little bit in perspective, of course. But in the end, there is something that we can agree upon quite easily. And this is a graph that I've been showed to via one of our partners called Liquibase, and they've used this graph, and I found it rather interesting. Because in the end, this also tells us a little bit about the speed. What we see at the latest stages where we are right now in the software development is that we see that we really have made it possible with DevOps, with Agile, with test automation and all the new tools that we have available and new ways of working, that we have been able to increase the application releases. We significantly improved the number of database or application releases to be deployed, which is of course wonderful. But this graph also tells us that the number of database deployment aren't in line with application releases. And the reason why this might be really interesting. In most cases, what we see is it just takes too long to have these database deployments be really done. It just takes too much effort, too much time, because there's nobody responsible. But it just takes too much time to get these database deployments done. And there's an issue with that, of course, because in the end, if we want to go to production as fast as we can, we want to have DevOps, Agile, and all that other stuff. But we also need to shift left, because what we try to achieve with shifting left, of course, is making sure that as much faults, software faults, bugs, all that kind of stuff is as early as discovered as we possibly can. So we should identify these bugs as early as possible. If we don't have the database deployments and the application releases in line with each other, or at least the gap should a little bit be more closed, then we're not able to make sure that we have exactly identified the right number of software faults or software code faults as early as we possibly can. And for that reason, we should really try to figure out how we can make sure that we deploy these databases more quickly and more frequently to make sure that these are in line with application releases. So there's a velocity gap. What we especially see is if applications go to production, that in some cases, the production data or the data inside the database itself is not in line with application release. And that's the reason why things go wrong when they turn out to go into production. So the better we are able to make database deployment in line with application releases, the better it gets. And therefore, we need also to address that we can create database deployments easily and accessible. So we should make sure that test data also becomes easily accessible and available. The same as we did with application releases. So in the end, if test data takes too long to become available, you should address those. So if the answer is yes, you should probably address your test data. If the answer is no, then we come to the last question that you could ask yourself. Are there too many teams for the number of databases? In the end, this last question is rather interesting, of course. And it's also maybe more mathematical. There's more like a formula behind this question than the other two at least. Because in the end, what we try to achieve and what I think should be perfect situation, maybe it can be even better than the perfect situation, which is not really the case, of course, but in the end, it should be possible that every team has its own database. I think an even better situation is that every individual has its own database, but maybe that's not really the case right now. That's maybe a little bit too far-fetched for now, but every team should have its own database. That's the formula. In the current situation, we see that there's a limited number of databases available for the number of teams. So there are limited sources for the number of teams that you will have, like this slide deck shows. So there are multiple teams working on the same database. And this is an issue because in the end, if team 1 wants to execute their automated test, or they want to do a manual test, or whatever test they want to execute, they will start searching for right test data cases, in most cases in their full-size copy of a production database. And while executing, maybe team number 3 or team number 4 wanted to use the exact same test data case as team 1 did, but it already got manipulated. So in the end, in most cases, what we see that customers try to achieve, or what clients in the end do, is that team 3 or team 4 searches for a test data case that's roughly the same as they early discovered for their first execution run, which they couldn't execute. So in most cases, we see that it happens somewhat like this. In the end, it will be more interesting, of course, that every team has its own database. I understand that there's a significant amount of cost that may be required, especially if you're using full-size copies of a production database, because it's just not possible to give every team a full-size copy of a database. So there's a solution that we should try to cover. What in the end, in most cases, happens during such a process is that customers start using a schedule that's roughly how I presented it in this slide deck, in this slide. Because what we typically see is that they in the end will say, week number 1, the dev team can use database number 1, and QA can use exactly or another QA database also in week 1. But if you take a look at this schedule, this is not DevOps anymore. This is not Agile anymore. It's nowhere near what we try to achieve. What we try to achieve in the end is that customers test data, or testers or software quality engineers, that they have test data easily accessible and readily available. And to do so, what we should try to achieve is make sure that every team has their own database. But therefore, the size is of significant importance. So what we try to achieve in the end is that we have small, reduced, flexible sets of test data available that we can deploy easily. So we can, with a single click or press of a button, that we have a new set of test data available, small, reduced. So instead of having 10 or 20 terabytes, that we can deploy small sets of test data of 200 gigabytes or 100 gigabytes or even less. And that's in the end what we try to achieve. And that's possible with solutions like subsetting. What's also rather interesting, especially from the subsetting perspective, is that we see that customers mature over time. So when we start off with subsetting a process at a customer, typically they still use 100% of a copy database, 100% copy of a database. But over time, the first run that we try to execute, we can reduce them to 50%. And that's something that customers are really enthusiastic about. But what we see over time, when customers start using DATPROF subset more and more and more, that they get even smaller, to 25%, and in some cases to even less than 1% of their original copy of a database. And with a 1% copy of a database, you can deploy a test data set easily, and you can make it readily available when you want it, when you need it. And that makes a significant impact on the software quality process. So in the end, using small test data sets will increase the speed of your software delivery, will improve also in the end the software quality process in itself, because you have a better understanding of what kind of test data you should have to make sure that you can go with the right quality to production. So I've almost come to a conclusion, or this is a little bit already the conclusion of this webinar. In the end, this is a little bit the decision tree that you can walk through. That if you walk through all of these questions, then you have an answer when you should address your test data issues. I haven't go into real detail in all the different questions. We can go into detail with these questions, then you can contact us and we would love to set up a meeting and do a deep dive in your test data issues with one of our test data experts. But if these are in conceptual, some of the issues you may or some of the questions you have to answer with yes, then it's worthwhile in most cases to understand what the real problem is and how you can address those, because it will have a significant impact and improvement on your software quality process. And with that being said, I want to thank you all for your time and joining this webinar. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope that you find it insightful and that with the sharing of this knowledge. And if there are any questions, I would take a look at them and I would love to answer them. So I will have a quick glance if there are any questions. I don't see any questions. So with that being said, I want to thank you for your time and I hope to see you soon with another webinar. Thank you so much. Goodbye.